Elliot, thank you so much for joining us here on the Israel-Syria border. Finally, we get to do this together.
I know, it's great. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I know. We've been planning this for a while, Elliot. You're such an expert on current events in Syria, Lebanon, how it affects Israel and the West, by the way. But this spot where we're standing right now in the Golan Heights has a long history of some very pivotal battles, conflicts.
This is actually a memorial to the 77th Tank Battalion that fought here in the Yom Kippur War 45 years ago. This area was the site of one of the major thrusts of the Syrian army on Yom Kippur. There was essentially a 3 to 4 day battle that took place here.
Right here where we're standing.
Here, literally right here. This front in front of us is really where the battle took place. As a matter of fact, there's a tank down here, the second one below us, that used to be here where we're standing, and that's where it was stopped in the battle. To understand the importance of this area today, we should go back a little bit further before the Yom Kippur War to the Six-Day War, 1967. During that war, the Israeli army faced the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians, also the Iraqis, the Lebanese, but 3 major fronts. This border was established on the last day of the Six-Day War in order to be defensible against the attack that didn't come until Yom Kippur 1973.
6 years later.
Exactly. In other words, the border that was established was tested as a defensive border on Yom Kippur 1973. So we have a line of volcanoes. That way is north, that way is east. Syrians would come from that direction. And this line of volcanoes, and we can see a couple of them out over there, the Avital, the Bental, they're part of this line. The volcanoes reduce this 60-mile long border to 3 passes.
Tough to get in, tough to get out.
Right? Think of obstacles that instead of a wide open space like we can see off in the distance, anybody coming in this direction has to go between the volcanoes.
It's tight.
And there are only 3 passes that you can use. Tight is in relative terms, okay? But tighter certainly than a wide open front.
Gotcha.
And one of those is here. And this is what's known in the English history as the Valley of Tears. Now, I say the English history because in Hebrew it's called Emek HaBacha, which means the Valley of Crying. It's got a whole story to itself. Leave that for a moment. This was where the Syrians tried to break through. And the guys who were here basically kept this pass closed for 4 days against overwhelming odds.
They were severely outnumbered and outgunned.
We're talking about odds of 200 to 30, sometimes more than that. 10, 12, 15 to 1 odds. And as in any battle, there are many reasons for a victory or a defeat. Yeah. But the topography here was certainly one of the reasons that they were able to hold. Yeah. And holding this gap, which also meant
Israel had the high ground.
Well, it wasn't so much the high ground as the gap ground. Gotcha. Held the high ground as well, but it meant that the Syrians couldn't get around it because of the mountains. The reason that the army stopped here in 1967 was good strategic and tactical thinking, having no idea that in 2018, we would be facing a different type of enemy with different political situation, different technology, and yet, because we're here, Al-Qaeda and ultimately Iran is 20 miles from population centers of Israel, as opposed to looking down on them and seeing them directly on site. So it's an interesting example, I think, of a good tactical decision that was made in 1967, now having an effect over 50 years later for different reasons, but good tactics are good tactics.
Yeah, Elliot, you can only imagine, God forbid, if Israel did not control the Golan Heights. As you said, the Iranian regime, the likes of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, they'd be literally
looking at Tiberias, Haifa.
Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret. Yes.
Exactly.
Elliot, this is great. I'm so glad you gave the historical overview, 1967, 1973, because now people will have a better idea why this area is so crucial today in 2018. We're going to talk about that some more now at a different location, right?
We're going to go over to what was a tank ramp in 1973 from where Israeli tanks stopped the Syrians, but it also, because it's that, it'll give us a great view out into Syria.
Wow, lead the way, my friend. Let's go. Elliot, wow, what an overlook we have here, overlooking Syria on a very windy day here in the Golan, on the mountains of Israel. As usual, hey, we could walk into Syria right now, right?
Yes, we could. The border is really right down here below us, maybe a mile or so away from here. Damascus, about 35 miles that way. If it were open, we could do lunch out there. Be there in, what, half an hour or so?
It just shows you, Elliot, the proximity of Israel's enemies.
Yes.
Damascus, the capital of Syria, about a 30-minute drive from where we're standing right now in Israel.
Yes. I think one of the things that's lost on people who are not from a country this small is how close, how tight everything is. And I mentioned earlier that the distance between here and the old border, we're talking about 11 miles, but 11 miles in normal military terms is insignificant. In Israeli terms, it's halfway to the Med.
Yeah, exactly. This country is the size, roughly, of the state of New Jersey.
Yes, with a populated area the size of Rhode Island.
Wow.
So we're talking tiny with enemies of global proportions.
Yes.
Which, among other things, means that we have no room for trial and error. Along the border, we have a very interesting situation at the moment, because up until a couple of months ago, the situation was somewhat different. The situation in Syria was somewhat different. We have this 60-mile border, essentially, which starts up there on the Hermon Range with Lebanon on the other side, and ends down on the other end with Jordan. The southern end of that border is where the revolt in Syria actually began, the Dara area.
March 2011.
That was down there, and it spread from there. And that area, up until a month ago, was controlled by an organization called Shuhada al-Yarmouk. You know them as ISIS. And up along this way, a whole bunch of other terrorist organizations, many of whom, including the ISIS organization, were defeated by the Syrian, Russian, Iranian offensive that just ended about a month ago, a little over a month ago.
So that Russia, Syria, Iran axis is really kind of mopping up and mowing away the jihadi groups along the Syria-Israel border.
Well, okay, they haven't gone all the way. They cleared that area, which was important to them, because they're looking at it strategically. They need to get rid of the centers of opposition, the major centers. And Dara was significant in part symbolically because it all started there.
Yeah, and you can see Dara from here on the Golan Heights.
Yes, from further south you can see it.
You can see ISIS land right across
We were able to see ISIS right across the border.
Yeah.
So they're gone. But the reason they went there, as I said, is for strategic reasons. Idlib is their next major target.
That's the big one.
That's the big one. And if they get rid of that, they've basically won.
So the Assad regime, when they take Idlib, they've won. This nearly what, 9 years now, nearly? The Syrian conflict.
And here I have to say, I predicted it.
Yes, you did. Elliot and I, folks, have known each other for a long time.
Yes.
We've been talking about these issues on a regular basis for years. And yes, you did call it.
And when they were eulogizing Assad, I said he wasn't going anywhere, in large part because he had nowhere to go. And when he gained the support of Iran and Hezbollah and then Russia, he basically solidified his position.
How big of a game changer, Elliot, real quick, was Russia's entry in September 2015 into the Syrian conflict on Assad's side?
It was a major game changer. It brought him a huge amount of force. It gave him the power to call in airstrikes. His air force was basically eliminated by the uprising. I say basically. He still had one, but it didn't have the punch that it did.
Yeah.
The Russians coming in on his side gave many, I'll call them fence sitters who were against him, the idea that maybe they should move to the other side of the fence that they're sitting on. And that was part of his strategy as well. He rallied many villages along the way, and I believe that's one of the reasons that he used chemical weapons. To have that carrot and stick in negotiating, for his people to go to those sort of not quite with him, not quite against him villages, or even the ones who went over to the other side, and tell them, look, amnesty today. Come back over and everything's okay. If not, you heard about that chemical weapon attack, right?
You're next.
You might be next, right? And that helped him a great deal. So the Russians, certainly a good deal of physical force, but a lot of psychological push on that as well.